I never know what to talk about when I'm called on to give a lesson. I'm always afraid that I'm going to speak on something that I talked about before or bore you with some things that are mostly not interesting. In fact, if I knew Brother Darrell was going to be here this morning, I would have gladly relinquished my time to let him have the lesson, because I'd much rather sit back and listen than do it myself, so to speak. In poking around this last week and in studying the scriptures, I ran across something that was pretty interesting, and I really hadn't given it much thought prior. And what kind of tripped my mind was I heard the sirens go by the house, and I thought, oh boy, somebody's in trouble or there's a fire somewhere. And it sparked a thought in my mind, fire. And I thought about fire in the Bible. I looked it up and found out that fire in the Bible is mentioned over 500 times. So I'm just assuming myself that it's pretty important and something that we should all be aware of. Now, I know that as you sit there this morning and you think about it, and you think about fire in the Bible, you probably think about God, how He used it to punish people and make people aware of the things that they've done or have done are wrong. And so I kind of did some research along those lines, and of course what I came up with was Sodom and Gomorrah. You can turn back and read about it in Genesis, I believe it's the 18th chapter. It goes into detail there. I'm not going to read a lot of scripture this morning because I have several points I want to make. But as we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, God had warned them that it was a city that was destitute for destruction because of the sinful nature and the things that were taking place and the things that were going on in the city. Of course, as we look to that chapter, we see that Lot and his family is involved there. And God had turned to him and asked him to try to straighten out the city or do the things that needed to be done to make it more livable or a more godly nation or city. But even in the attempts that Lot made, we find that he could not do anything about it. Even his family was concerned and destined. And so God came to him and warned him and said that He was going to destroy that city with fire and brimstone, and that Lot needed to take his family and move on. Now, it didn't come without some special instructions. Of course, God told Lot and his family that as they left, that there were certain things that they needed to do, and the one thing especially that they needed to do was not to turn and look back. Now, as Lot and his wife and 2 daughters left the city, of course, I'm sure that it must have been hot, and the things going on there must have been pretty terrible. And so as they were headed to, I think it said there, the city of Zoar, we understand that Lot's wife couldn't help it. She just couldn't bear it anymore, and being inquisitive, she turned around and immediately was changed into a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters moved on to the city of Zoar, and of course, the city of Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed with that fire and brimstone. You know, when we think about fire, we are enticed or sometimes are inquisitive just what it can do. You know, we see the devastation and the things that happen as something is burned up or is caught on fire. If it's let go, eventually it just turns to ashes. And there's nothing left but the ashes. I think as we think of ourselves as young kids, we probably all experimented with playing with matches or smoking or whatever it might be. And sometimes we get into trouble. My wife tells a story that when she was a little girl, her and her two brothers went over to what she called her favorite uncle's house. And while the adults are inside visiting, of course, the kids played outside, and her uncle had an old antique car sitting back in the corner of the lot. And so they asked if they could play in the car, and the uncle said, well, sure, go ahead, but just be careful. He said there's no keys in it, and go ahead. Of course, as young kids do, somewhere along the line, one of her brothers found a cigarette. And so, to speak, they thought, well, to hide from everyone, they'd just sit in the car and smoke that cigarette. She tells a story that the brother got excited when he thought somebody was coming out to check on them or view on them and threw the cigarette in the seat. By the time the fire department got there, the car was a total loss. And my wife's favorite uncle was not her favorite anymore. He was very distraught and upset that they had destroyed his car. Sometimes fire can be good, but in most cases it can be bad. One of the instances that I'd like to tell you about this morning is contained in Acts, the 27th and 28th chapters, where it talks about Paul, who happens to be one of my favorite apostles, and I think I've told you this before. And Brother Darrell, about a year ago, had a nice lesson and showed the path and the cities that they went through as they made their transgression down south to get to where they were going. And of course, as they got to the sea, they boarded a boat, as it said, and headed off towards the city there. And of course, the wind came up and it started to rain and be nasty weather, and we know the facts and the situation there, that the boat was tossed about pretty well and was almost lost or sank. And to make the short story short, of course, the boat finally ran up on the island of Melita. And they were all wet, all the prisoners are wet and soaked, and had swam from the ship to the island. And it being cold and rainy, of course, they decided to make a fire to warm themselves, and Paul gathered some bundles of sticks and put them together. And as he was gathering them up, of course, the story goes that a snake or a viper come out of the twigs or the branches there, and it attached itself or bit Paul on the arm. All of the natives there, they were scared and knew the fact that Paul was a prisoner, and they thought was probably the most sinful and degraded person in the world, and so they all was afraid of Paul. And as the story goes, of course, Paul shook the snake off and shook it into the fire after he'd been bitten. And again, the natives were amazed because Paul was still on his feet and hadn't suffered any thing that caused him to be put to death or caused him to die there. And so, of course, the natives changed their mind and thought that Paul was some sort of a god. And they began to bow down and praise him and hail him and say what a great person he was. And he must have been sent by God. And he must be one of God's because he was not killed by the snake. So you see that sometimes fire can be good. I know that probably most of you have probably built a bonfire or gone camping and had a little fire going in the back areas there, and realize that you can only get so close, because as the fire flames up or as it begins to get, I would say, deadly, it begins to bother you, and you can only get so close. I know a lot of times when I go camping, I'll start taking off my clothes or shedding some of the apparel so that you can sit closer or get closer to the fire, especially if you're going to do marshmallows or s'mores or whatever it might be. And after a time, as the fire dies down, you begin to scoot in closer and closer. And finally somebody gets the wise idea that they're going to stoke the fire, and they get in there and poke around, and of course the flames jump up again, and wow, you have to move away about 20 feet because you can't stand the heat or stand the flame. My mother and dad used to be kind of somewhat ambulance chasers. They listened to the radio, and if anything was going on in town and they heard about it, they had to go see what was going on. Well, come to fact that one of the popular restaurants in our hometown there caught fire and was a pretty good blaze. Of course, Mom and Dad, they rousted us up and got us in the car and said, we got to go downtown and check this out and see what's happening with this fire. And I remember as a young boy, only about 6 or maybe 8 years old, when we got there, we could feel the heat or feel the flames. It was a pretty good fire. And of course, as we begin to get closer and closer, we could feel the heat and the intense more and more. And suddenly the Gestapo or the law came out and of course pushed everyone back because it was afraid somebody might get burned or might get hurt, and they didn't want to take the chance or take the loss. And so as we think about it, fire can be very deadly and very life-threatening. There again, I knew a man back in my hometown who, at a young age, got caught in a house fire. And by the time they finally got him out, he had first and second degree burns over, I'd say, probably 80 or 90% of his body. He went through many operations and skin grafts, and when you talk to him and ask him about it, he said going through the experience and experiencing fire was like hell on earth. He said it was a terrible thing. He said not only the initial burn when he was burned or whatever, but then the painful surgeries and things that he had to go through and suffer from thereafter. He didn't live to be very old. He died at a younger age. I think he was probably 40 or 50 years old when Dick finally passed away. But I always remember him talking and telling us about that horrible experience about getting burned in that fire. He said he cried out and he yelled, but no one heard his cries, and by the time they finally figured out that he was in there, of course, it was too late, and ended up with the terrible burns. As we go back into the book of Exodus, another little tidbit here about fire concerning Moses. In the 3rd chapter, it talks about how Moses was the keeper of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro in Midian. And as they were there close to the, as it says, Mount Horeb, an angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Stop and think about that. You know, I just mentioned that fire can be pretty devastating and cause a lot of problems. But here God was involved, and he struck this bush on fire, and as it mentioned here in this first few verses of the 3rd chapter, that it was flaming in fire, but the bush was not consumed. Of course, when Moses saw this, he was inquisitive and he wanted to check it out. And so he went and he looked at it and saw the flames in the midst of the bush there. And it says, and he looked, and behold, it burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And he says that Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. You know, I'd probably be the same way. I'd probably try to figure out why this bush was on fire and what was going on there and just why it wasn't being burned up, because everything that fire touches, we know, seems to burn things up and destroy. It says here in the 4th verse, and when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him in the midst of the bush, and said unto Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. He says, I'm right here, Lord. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. So not only was God putting on a display by the burning bush, he came to Moses and told him that he was standing on holy ground to take off his shoes and not contaminate the area. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmaster, for I know their sorrows. And I come down to deliver them out of the hand of Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land unto a good land, and a large unto a land flowing with milk and honey. And the Lord was talking, of course, about delivering them out of the land of Egypt and getting them over to the land of Canaan. And he told Moses that he needed someone to do the job and take care of the situation. And of course, Moses was elected. And as we know, that Moses delivered them children out of the land of Egypt and delivered them unto the Canaanites and unto those Hittites and all those tites there that it talks about in the 8th verse. But Moses did the job, and it was all started by fire. All started by fire. Moses inquisitive about that bush burning away there. And being consumed. If we go back towards the end of the Old Testament, back to the 3rd chapter of Daniel, another very exciting story that I'm always intrigued about and think about, especially when somebody tells me that they're going to be cremated when they die or whatever. And that's Nebuchadnezzar, the old king, when he came across Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. As the story goes, and as we read it there in the 3rd chapter, that King Nebuchadnezzar, being the wicked man that he was, decided to build himself an idol out of gold. And it tells, just how big he made it and what it was like and so on and so forth. And of course, they were there in, as it says, the province of Babylon. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he sent to gather together the princes, the governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, and sheriffs, whoever it might be, and told them that he had built this gold idol. And yet he was going to command everyone that came close to that gold idol to bow down and worship it. Now Nebuchadnezzar, being the mean man that he was, he sent out those men and said, if you find anyone that's not willing to meet this or do what I ask, they're going to be killed. So he had a large furnace there that he kept going, and as the story goes, would burn things in. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being of the Jewish persuasion, and they're in Babylon, I don't know why, would not bow down and worship his gold idol. And as you read on there in the 3rd chapter, that of course this upset Nebuchadnezzar, and he commanded that they be found and be brought and thrown into the fiery furnace. And it says that they stoked that furnace to 7 times what it normally ran at. Now you think about that. If you stoke a fire or start it from a little kindling, and you keep adding to it, first twigs, then the little logs, and finally you get to the big logs of the tree trunk. By the time you get it all together, it makes a pretty good fire. And it says here that it was 7 times what it normally operated at. And so as those guards took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to throw in the furnace, when they opened the doors, it said the guards were killed or died immediately from the flames and from the heat. They just couldn't stand it or take it, and they perished right there on the spot. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was in the furnace there, and as Nebuchadnezzar looked in, he not only saw 3 people in there, but he saw a 4th person. Wondering who that was, of course, he had a way that he could look in there and just assume that it was probably God. They had told him that even if they didn't bow down and worship his gold idols, that God would see them through and take care of them. And here they are, as they are in this fiery furnace, everyone thinking that they're going to be burned up or be destroyed. It says that when they came out, that there was no hair or any hair upon their body that was singed. And it says, and they didn't even smell like smoke. You know, that's the worst thing about when you go camping. You know, you get close to the fire to do the marshmallows or whatever, and by the time you're done, you get that terrible smell all over you, and sometimes you can't stand yourself because you smell so bad. But it says they came out of that furnace and none of them even had the smell of smoke on their person. So we see here's just another example where God intervened and fire was used and no one was hurt. The last example that I'd like to talk about this morning is taken out of the 21st chapter of Revelations. You know, all these other ones, we saw that God was involved, but there was no destruction to the people that were involved. But John the Revelator writes in John the 21st chapter and in the 8th verse about the lake that burneth with fire. You know, I've always been inquisitive about that, you know, the lake that burns with fire. As you all know, I think I've mentioned before that I was an avid boater, of course, when I was younger, and I saw several boats on the Mississippi River catch fire and get destroyed. One time we was even out boating and a houseboat caught fire with some kids on it. Of course, they dove in the water, and we being in the area went over and picked them up out of the water and sat there and watched while the boat burned to the water line. So I'm always inquisitive when I read it in the Bible about the lake that burneth with fire. And we know that God has promised us that if we're not found faithful in the end, if we die in our sins, that we're going to be sent or die in the lake that burneth with fire. The scriptures reveal that it's the second death. And there again, I've always asked myself, well, what's the second death all about? Well, what he's referring to there, of course, the first death is when we die here upon earth. But the second death is what John is talking about here, is when we're cast into hell or cast into the lake that burneth with fire. And he says here, but the fearful and the unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters, all liars, shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. He says, which is the second death. You know, think about that, brothers and sisters. We can think about fire this morning and what it does to us here or can do to us here up on this earth. If God can intervene and save us from that, He can intervene and save our souls. You know, people talk about the old body. You know, they say ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And often the question is asked, well, what happens if your body is burned up in a fire? How is God going to, as He says in the Scriptures, come and return you or put you back together? I don't ask that question because I know what God can do. You know, if He can save 3 souls out of a fiery furnace, He can save our souls. If He could come to Moses in a burning bush and talk Moses into saving the children of that were caught up in Egypt there, God can save us. People will say, well, and it's true that our body here upon earth is just a shell. It's just a vessel that carries our soul while we're here upon this earth. When we die, the soul goes to heaven or goes to hell, wherever it might go. And our old fleshly body, our old bag of bones, the old suitcase that we live in while we're here upon earth, goes back to ashes or goes back to dust. And if you stop and think about it, God has the power. God has the opportunity. God has the ability to save us. If you're a Christian here this morning, I want to thank you for your attention and listening. If you're one here this morning that has never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, I would beg you by the scriptures that we just delved into that you would take them seriously. If you don't want to be found or caught up in that lake that burneth with fire, you need to change your life. You need to do things different or give yourselves to God. If there's one within the sound of my voice here this morning that has never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, come forward and we'll take your confession and baptize you into the body of Christ. If there's an errant Christian that is strayed from the path of right and duty, somewhere along the line you feel that you have done wrong and you need to get back to God's good graces, come forward also, let us know. And let the brothers here pray in your behalf. And prayerfully, you'll be reinstated as a Christian once again. If there be either Christ present, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
All falling together.